Many like it so much, in fact, that they never go back, unwilling to accept a lower quality of life for a higher cost. So that's the Hong Kong economic model. Severely restrict the supply of land, then sell it for extortionate prices, then use that revenue to support a world-class city despite dirt-cheap taxes. But there's still one missing ingredient. For this to work, someone has to keep buying all these million-dollar parking spots. It can't be locals who are quite unfairly priced out of their own housing market. And it can't be expats. There simply aren't enough of them. Luckily, it has an almost bottomless source of demand right next door, called China. When Beijing finally loosened its grip on the economy in the 1980s, it instantly created an enormous amount of wealth right on Hong Kong's doorstep. Some 800 new Chinese billionaires and countless more millionaires were minted between 2000 and 2018 alone. But this wealth was extremely anxious, and for good reason. As these entrepreneurs would soon learn, the Chinese government would now let you get rich, but there was no guarantee it would let you stay rich. Much has changed in China over the past 40-odd years, to say the least. But this much, decidedly, has not. Your company can employ hundreds of thousands of people. It doesn't matter. In 2021, the $100 billion private tutoring industry was wiped off the earth with a stroke of a pen. You can accumulate astronomical wealth. It doesn't matter. Jack Ma, formerly China's richest man, was disappeared for saying vaguely disparaging things about the government. Once. You can even keep your head down and be a good rat. But it doesn't matter. Public employees have been ordered to return their end-of-year bonuses during economic downturns. As long as your money stays within its borders, it can always be taken back. So, what do you, a Chinese supermarket or property mogul, do? You run. And where do you go? Somewhere safe. Somewhere with the rule of law. Somewhere with free and independent judges that respect private property and due process. Well, Hong Kong had all of that. And it had incredibly low taxes. And it had an incredibly strong real estate market. And it was just a stone's throw away. And there was a good chance the person selling you that $1 million parking space even spoke the same language. It was a match made in heaven. Chinese elites got a safe place to stash their cash outside the mainland, and Hong Kong got insanely rich off land sales. Now, the key to all this, the only reason it worked, was that Hong Kong was caught in a strange political limbo. There are countless free democracies around the world, and there are countless more unfree autocracies. The two, freedom and democracy, so often go hand in hand that it feels strange to even say this. But Hong Kong, uniquely, was stuck somewhere in between. It had freedom without democracy. Its government has never been directly accountable to the public. During British rule, London appointed a governor. Then, after the 1997 handover, Beijing effectively began appointing a chief executive. This was a necessary ingredient to its economic model because if it were a democracy, voters would, quite sensibly, pressure their representatives to solve the housing crisis. And if they did, if land became plentiful, the whole system would collapse. The government would lose this source of revenue. Yet, despite its lack of democracy, Hong Kong was relatively free. Money, ideas, and people moved in and out of the territory nearly unimpeded. When dissidents were driven out of the mainland, they often fled to Hong Kong, where they could speak their minds. There was no great firewall. Professors had academic freedom. There were no capital controls. And corporations trusted its courts to be fair and independent to the tune of billions of dollars. This was necessary because if it wasn't free, investors would simply move their money elsewhere. The whole point of getting your money out of the mainland was to escape the party's control. And this truly one-of-a-kind combination, freedom without democracy, produced a truly one-of-a-kind city. 99% of cities around the world follow the same basic pattern because 99% are influenced by the same economic forces. Since building up is more expensive than building out, the convenience of the former only outweighs the cost for some people and industries. They inevitably cluster together in one or two pockets of density. This is the downtown core. The rest sprawl outward. Nature succumbs to the efficient use of land until the city is drained of all its color. But not in Hong Kong. Its shortage of usable land leaves no room for anything less than 100% efficiency. 1/4 of the city is built up to its absolute limits, every inch of land accounted for and utility maximized. Meanwhile, the other 3/4 that surround it remain frozen in time, green, pristine, untouched nature. The effect this creates is breathtaking. You get the extreme density of Midtown Manhattan directly adjacent to the extreme serenity of the Hawaiian jungle, and you can peer down at the former from the latter. Hong Kong has more skyscrapers than New York, Chicago, Miami, and Houston combined, far more than any other city on Earth. And it has the beach, and it has mountains, and it has clean, affordable, timely public transit to move between them. Earlier, I joked that developers would love to sprinkle the jungle with 60-story high-rises. But that's not a joke. It's really what Hong Kong looks like. This is not a 3D render. It's actual footage of an apartment complex. And it's a 20-minute hike away from this incredible vista. In what other city do you get this view from a public bus? In what other city is the term urban jungle made so literal? Nature and city colliding in such close proximity that wild boars invade train stations where white-collar professionals are commuting to work. What other city lets you escape the cubicle on your lunch break with a view like this? Of course, this is not without its drawbacks. At 300 square feet, this is roughly the average size apartment for 2 middle-class Hong Kongers. This is the laundry room, this is the kitchen, and this, in case you missed it, is the bedroom. Nothing about this is fair or compassionate. And in no real democracy would voters tolerate being squeezed into coffin-sized apartments while wild monkeys roamed freely across the remaining 75% of all land. All of this is to say, there's no other place quite like it because there's no political system quite like it. And there's a reason. It's fragile. The people, for example, can exercise their freedoms to demand democracy. And that's exactly what they did. For a brief moment in 2019, there was hope that this paradox could be resolved by Hong Kong gaining democracy. That summer, 2 of its 7 million residents marched in the streets, protesting a proposed bill that would allow extradition to mainland China. Soon, this evolved into a broader pro-democracy movement. Miraculously, it managed to sustain this momentum for nearly a year, holding major protests almost every weekend. But then, while the world was distracted by the pandemic, Beijing reacted, resolving the paradox, but not in the protesters' favor. Instead, it exploited the absence of democracy to dismantle Hong Kong's freedom. It foisted upon the city, without a single vote, a national security law, which outlaws the vaguely defined crimes of secession, subversion, terrorism, and collusion. Now, on paper, that's it. Hong Kong still has its own separate passport, currency, and legal system. Even the courts are still widely considered fair and independent. In fact, 6 British and Australian judges sit on its Court of Final Appeal. The national security law doesn't change any of this. What it does do, however, is create a second parallel court system, and this one is most certainly not fair or independent. Its judges are hand-selected by the government. Its trials can be held in secret, and its police don't need search warrants. So, what qualifies as endangering national security? So far, reading a newspaper in public, publishing children's books, and wearing the wrong color shirt. In short, whatever the government decides. Which means any person, any company, any property or bank account in the territory could be placed under Beijing's control. With neither freedom nor democracy,
we all know Texas Instruments, or TI, as the calculator company. The TI-84 calculators are found in every high school and college in America, yet they are secretly one of the world's most successful companies. They currently sit at rank 56 on the S&P 500, almost in the top 10%. How is a calculator company doing so well? Well, as it turns out, their history dates back far beyond calculators. They created possibly the most important invention in history, even more important than the silicon transistor. This is the untold story of Texas Instruments. May 10, 1954, a conference for the Institute of Radio Engineers is underway, and various scientists and engineers are giving talks. In the front row sits Gordon Peel, a Texas Instruments engineer, and there's a common theme among the talks. They all complain about germanium transistors. Transistors are the foundation of computers, and act as switches to control electrical current. The standard at this point was germanium, great for electrical currents, but with a major downside, it consistently failed at high temperatures. The obvious solution was to use the element right above it on the periodic table, silicon. It was more stable in extreme heat and more abundant, but this also came with its own challenges. Refining the silicon for the transistors required advanced manufacturing techniques that simply didn't exist. As the other engineers complain at the conference, Gordon sits with a wide smile on his face as he fiddles with something in his pocket. The current speaker remarks that no one should expect a silicon transistor for years. With a smug expression, Gordon stands up to give his talk. The audience murmurs and he begins to speak. Contrary to what my colleagues have told you about unique prospects for silicon transistors, I happen to have a few of them here in my pocket. The jaws of every audience member collected in bombs. This was Texas Instruments' breakout moment. As a small electronic startup, they had solved the biggest problem plaguing the chip industry, and were propelled into a leading technology player. What's fascinating is that they weren't even the first. Bell Laboratories had technically beat them by a couple of months and produced the very first workable silicon transistor. Yet, there was a key difference. Bell was a research lab in a complacent telecom giant, AT&T. Texas Instruments, however, not only solved the problem, but they were positioned to manufacture it in a few short months. Basically overnight, Texas Instruments aggressively invested in mass production, and soon they were producing silicon semiconductors for the entire world. Yet, Texas Instruments was facing another huge problem, and there was much more at stake. Computers had stagnated and couldn't increase in power because of how many components were needed, and each of those needed to be wired to other components which each served a single function. This was called the tyranny of conduct. Computers were a mess of cables upon cables, some spanning 50 miles of wiring. The silicon transistor was just one race. The tyranny of numbers was the real marathon in the industry. This problem was halting the progress of computers and had reached a dead end. Texas Instruments was trying their best, but the odds were stacked against them. Like the silicon transistor, they were competing against other giants like Bell Labs, Fairchild Semiconductor, RCA, General Electric, and many more. Giants who had basically infinite funding. Whoever could solve this impossible problem would not only make billions, but dictate the future of computers and technology itself. Whoever won this race could rule the technology world. Texas Instruments was by no means the favorite in this marathon. But one engineer was about to change that for decades to come. Jack Kilby found himself at Texas Instruments in 1958. He had just graduated with a master's in electrical engineering from the University of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Kilby had an unhealthy fascination with electronics, specifically making electronics smaller and smaller to make products better, like hearing aids or radios. TI was the only company that agreed to let me work on electronic component miniaturization more or less full time, and it turned out to be a great fit. Joining Texas Instruments came with a downside, though. As a new employee, he didn't have the right to a summer vacation, which basically all of his colleagues took. So he'd have to work on the tough job alone for some time. But this would actually turn out to be a blessing in disguise. Kilby spent the summer dabbling in the problem that everyone else was struggling with, the tyranny of numbers. Before long, a realization dawned on him. What if instead of connecting separate components connected with miles of cable, the components were all built into a single flat piece of semiconductor material?
Stop.
Get rid of the vast amount of wires and shrink the size of the circuit dramatically. With that,
Stop.
Kilby quickly got to work. In a matter of weeks, Kilby had a prototype and he told a meeting with the company's management. On September 12, 1958, findings. He showed them a piece of germanium connected to an electrical testing unit. Kilby pressed the switch, and management watched in awe as the screen showed a smooth, repeating wave. The germanium was functioning as a complete circuit, with all the components working together. Kilby had solved the world of computing's greatest problem. He had just created what we now know as the integrated circuit. A celebration erupted within Texas Instruments. They had just made an another colossal breakthrough, just a few years after commercializing the silicon transistor. Everyone congratulated Kilby and quickly began moving to capitalize upon his discovery. A patent was filed soon after, in February of 1959. The U.S. patent 3138743 for miniaturized electronic circuits, the very first integrated circuit. This invention was about to change the world. All computing devices and electronics as we know them today directly rely on this invention. But Kilby and Texas Instruments were about to encounter another roadblock. Little did they know, they were about to go to war. Unknown to Kilby before Texas Instruments, a rival company in California was also making a breakthrough. But not just any engineer. The engineer, Robert Noyce. Known as the mayor of Silicon Valley, Noyce was a co-founder of Fairchild Semiconductor. He would also go on to form Intel in the following years. He was the opposite of Jack Kilby, not introverted, but a charismatic, famous leader in Silicon Valley. As Kilby was celebrating his breakthrough, Noyce was also hell-bent on solving the tyranny of numbers, and had independently come to the same hypothesis, putting multiple components on a single piece of semiconductor. Soon, he had also created an integrated circuit prototype. Geniuses had reached the same conclusion in a matter of months. But there was one crucial difference that stacked odds against Texas Instruments. In the race for the silicon transistor, Texas Instruments won, not by being first, but by being better. They were in a better position to mass produce them. Yet, can't call it a very simple crap just a few years later. The industry was still commonly using germanium for transistors, which is also what Kilby used for his integrated circuit. Noyce, on the other hand, used silicon instead, knowing it was more stable at higher heat and was the future of the industry. It was also a monolithic integrated circuit. Kilby set some wires and thus couldn't be mass-produced at the scale of Noyce's creation. On July 30th, 1959, Noyce filed for a patent for his creation, which was approved and granted within 2 years. But things aren't so simple. Texas Instruments also had a patent for the integrated circuit. Fairchild and them both believed they had solved the problem and had the right to capitalize on it. Thus began the patent war. For the next several years, both companies battled in court. The prize was the future of computing itself. Texas Instruments was first, but Noyce's invention was better. Eventually, they came to an agreement, but it wasn't in TI's favor. They could produce and manufacture the integrated circuit, but had to make license payments to Fairchild. This would obviously hurt TI's profits, and to make matters worse, the courts eventually sided with Fairchild as the rightful owner of the monolithic integrated circuit. Moreover, the years of legal fees had diverted huge resources away from more research and innovation. Employee morale at Texas Instruments was at an all-time low. They needed to bounce back, but how? Several years later, Texas Instruments is still alive, producing microchips for the industrial and military sectors. But they needed something new. They needed another breakthrough to propel them forward. The company president, Pat Hagerty, believed this would come from consumer products instead of industrial, something that used their existing chips that they could mass produce. Hagerty entrusted this task to Kilby and a small group of associates. Kilby and his team began evaluating their options, and soon the team settled on a single idea. But Texas Instruments, after the slaying of the integrated circuit, made sure to keep this close to their chest. It was a top-secret project codenamed Project Caltech. The team worked on a small electronic device which included a keyboard, a screen, a portable power supply, and a central processor. In September 1967, Kilby and his team applied for a patent after several revisions and received a U.S. patent number 3819921, the portable calculator. All calculators at this point were gigantic and were only available for big businesses and the government. This one was the size of a book. The first product was the TI-2500, and despite being $120 each, or $1,100 today, demand was through the roof. In just 1 year, 17 million units were sold. Just 2 years later, that number had jumped to 45 million. Kilby might have missed the success of the integrated circuit, but his work led to the creation of the handheld calculator. It transformed the future of education, science, and mathematics. This put TI back in the game, and soon it began picking up momentum. While producing calculators with a new influx of revenue, the company leaned back into the semiconductor industry that they helped create. Only this time they had a different focus. Their rivals, like Fairchild, as well as the recently formed Intel, were producing digital chips for computing. Fast and complicated chips like CPUs, TI decided to focus on less flashy semiconductors that were equally important, analog chips. These processed information like light, sound, or pressure, and were used for machines in factories, medicine, aerospace, and automotives. It was a quiet, genius move that allowed them to thrive for decades. The demand might have been high in computing, but it had a lot of ups and downs. Analog, on the other hand, was stable and there was always demand. They were in the perfect position for long-term success in all kinds of industries. For example, when EV started booming, it wasn't just Nvidia who was positioned perfectly, but also Texas Instruments. Same with self-driving cars, robots, and medical equipment. Analog has allowed Texas Instruments to thrive far into the future. In fact, in their 2023 investor report, Analog accounted for 74% of the revenue at over $13 billion. The story of Texas Instruments shows one truth. Being first isn't what matters. What matters is being the best. The truth allowed them to win, but it also hit them hard with the integrated circuit. But the important thing is that they rebounded to set themselves up for the future. Despite losing to Fairchild, it's TI that's still around. Fairchild split into several companies, including both Intel and EhKt, which are a huge company, but they don't carry the Fairchild name. So TI technically got the last laugh, as they're still a strong and independently traded company. Even though they couldn't capitalize on the integrated circuit, it was a huge milestone for computing, and Jack Kilby got his recognition. Both Kilby and Noyce were recognized as equal co-founders, and he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Physics in 2000. And that is the untold story of the calculator company that actually changed the world. If you would like to see more questions logically answered, comment that down below. But until then, I'm Hari. I'll see you guys on the next one.
Meanwhile, President Trump slashing Biden's bloated clean energy programs, and the cuts are already being felt. They even plan to claw back $20 billion earmarked for climate projects allocated during Biden's double-bird cleaned-up period last year. And what else has DOGE uncovered? Just tens of millions wasted on social programs for just about every country in the world. There's social cohesion in Malai, a gender equality hub in Cambodia. HUD, that's Housing and Urban Development, misplaced $1.9 billion under Joe Biden's watch. That's not loose change. You don't find that in sofa cushions. That's a national GDP. Kevin, what do you make of what President Trump, Elon Musk, and Doge have managed to not just uncover, but claw back and stop in just a matter of weeks?
This is why I'm talking, because we have a unique situation. Elon Musk with his own international broadcast network, he can publish anything he wants at any time. Those are these agencies, 48 hours later, so list of crazy stuff that we just detailed. People see it all through the U.S. and around the world and say, this is nuts. And it just feels, what else is out there? So what's happening here has never happened before. He can only do this with the power of the executive behind him. Because all of the people that are managing these mandates and these programs are being embarrassed by this. Whether you just got the job or whether you're there in the Biden administration, Elon doesn't care who you are. He just publishes it anyways, and then it's all over your face. There's a lot of tension going on here with the management of these programs, and particularly when we start talking with the FAA and the Pentagon. Oh, baby, wait till that one comes out, because that is always going to be a black hole saying, well, it's for defense, and I can't tell you what it's for. But now there's accountability. If there's so much fat dripping off these chickens, this is the best barbecue I've ever seen.
So, instead of making money, it's losing. It's losing money because of bureaucrats. And it comes back to repeat myself, because I'm elderly and I don't really remember what I said yesterday. It is my money. It is your money. Every dollar, either you gave it to the government unwillingly because you were taxed, or the government has borrowed it on your back and the back of your children.
President Trump has been in office for 1 month, and he's already racked up quite an impressive list of accomplishments. Now, today at the White House, in their press briefing, Deputy Chief of Staff, our President Stephen Miller, had a complete rundown of them all. Take a look.
No president comes close to what Donald Trump has achieved over just the last 30 days. He has ended all DEI across the federal government. He has also saved women's sports by ending the participation of men in women's sports. He's reestablished the scientific and biological truth that there are only two sexes in this country, male and female. He has undertaken a historic cost-cutting effort across the federal government, launching the first ever Department of Government Efficiency, already saving $50 billion in a single year, which over a 10-year period would be $500 billion. He has renamed the Gulf of Mexico to its correct and proper name, the Gulf of America. He has ended the weaponization of the federal government. He has ended all federal censorship of free speech. He has also restored the death penalty at the Department of Justice. He has finally created a situation where the federal health agencies in this country will be focused on preventing disease. Border crossings, since the day he took office, are down 95%. And he's used the United States military to fully seal the southern border, and he did it in under 1 month.
Once again, our strong promises made, promises kept, like we always do. After that, Stephen Miller got the chance to give the media mob a little civic club. Take a look. What's happening?
It is true that many of the people in this room for 4 years failed to cover the fact that Joe Biden was mentally incompetent and was not running the country. It is also true that many people in this room who have used this talking point that Elon is not elected fail to understand how government works. So I'm glad for the opportunity to brief civics lesson. The whole will of democracy is imbued into the elected president. That president then appoints staff that impose that democratic will onto the government. The threat to democracy, the existential threat to democracy, is the unelected rule.
This one landed like a bomb last night, courtesy of the Washington Post's Jacob Bogage. Headline, Trump expected to take control of USPS fire postal board, officials say. Quote, Trump is expected to issue an executive order as soon as this week to fire the members of the Postal Service's governing board and place the agency under the control of the Commerce Department and Secretary Howard Lutnick. The board is planning to fight Trump's order, three sources told the Washington Post. In an emergency meeting Thursday, the board retained outside counsel and gave instructions to sue the White House if the president were to remove members of the board or attempted to alter the agency's independent status. After the Post broke that exclusive story last night, the White House then denied that Trump was planning to issue any such executive order. Then today, when the Commerce Secretary, Lutnick, was being sworn in, Trump was asked about his plans for the 250-year-old agency, whose existence is spelled out in the Constitution. He said that he and Secretary Lutnick are, quote, looking at it. Joining us now is the reporter who broke this story, the Washington Post, Jacob Bogage. Mr. Bogage, thank you for coming back. I had a feeling we'd be back talking to you soon as you continue to break story after story in Washington. What's your understanding of the state of play around this Postal Service controversy?
Well, thank you for having me, Rachel. It's good to be back. That was one heck of an intro. The state of play is in flux. Like you mentioned, you reported the story with anonymous but pretty ironclad sourcing. The White House, after it published, denied it, and then President Trump today didn't just say that he and Secretary Lutnick were looking at it. He acknowledged that they were planning what he called some sort of merger between the Postal Service and the Commerce Department. So this is very much an active question in the White House. And at the Postal Service, people are really uncertain. That goes from rank and file.
March 23rd, 2021. Intel's new CEO, Gelsinger, stands in the studio. The camera crew bustles around him as he prepares to address the company and share a strategy. To save Intel. The tech giant had once ruled the industry, yet recently kept beaten down time and time again. Morale within the company was at rock bottom, and investors were losing patience as the stock had been going sideways for over 20 years. Intel needed a savior, and the board believed that they found one. The cameras begin rolling, and everyone watches the movie. The CEO unveiled his strategy. Great companies are able to come back from periods of challenge and come back stronger and more capable than ever. IDF 2.0 is an elegant strategy that only Intel can deliver, and a winning formula. This was Intel's moment. Employees, investors, and the board had total faith in Gelsinger. They were going to take back the industry and rise to the top once again. Yet, that's not how it played out. Less than 4 years later, Intel is in flames. Gelsinger's perfect strategy has backfired, costs are being cut, the stock price is plummeting, and Gelsinger has been forced out. This is the story of how Intel destroyed itself. First, we need some context. Intel has been falling behind their competitors for decades, despite creating the world's first commercial microprocessor chip. In Intel 4004, along with their long list of breakthroughs, they completely ignored the boom of smartphones. Even when Steve Jobs offered them the chance to make chips for the iPhone, they declined. According to them, the margins were too small. But that's not all. They also totally underestimated GPUs, thinking they were a niche product for gaming, and instead focused on CPUs. Needless to say, when combining them, especially AI, they were very, very wrong. They also completely underestimated AMD's comeback with Ryzen. So, why the lack of foresight? Well, Intel slowly became complacent. They were such an integral part of PCs with their deal with Microsoft Windows, aka Wintel. They made billions from this, but this also made them blindsided when PC sales began to slow in the 2010s. To call Intel a slow mover would be an understatement. They needed a new radical change. They needed a bold new strategy. They needed Patrick Gelsinger. In early 2021, the board appointed Gelsinger as CEO, and there was reason to be confident. Many giant companies fall into the trap of putting someone with accounting or general business experience into the role of CEO. Intel themselves had done this for most of the 2000s, but Gelsinger was different. He had been that Intel for years, and even the beginning career as CEO. He was the chief architect on the 486, Intel's first high-frequency chip, which is still a huge part of the year today. It wasn't just the board either. Intel staff was ecstatic. Even those inevitably laid off by Gelsinger believed he was the right person for the job. So, what was his plan? As he addressed the company, he laid out his vision to put Intel back on top. We are setting a course for a new era of innovation and product leadership at Intel. We will use IBM 2.0 to design the best products and manufacture them in the best way possible for every category we compete in. August 1st, 2019. There's a celebration at Verizon. Staff are toasting a farewell to their CEO, Lowell McAdam. People are sharing their fondest memories of his achievements and thanking him for his 7 years of leading the company. There's laughter, speeches, and a positive atmosphere. But beneath the laughter and speeches, the air is heavy with a very different emotion, a tense anxiety. In reality, Verizon is balancing on a knife's edge. They had just spent billions on a segment that is a colossal failure. Now everyone is slightly nervous. Leadership minds are heavy as they think, how the heck did we pay off $150 billion in debt?
And we begin this morning in Washington, where a major vote could change the way we browse the internet.
McAdam had left the company in a dangerous state as the most fragile telecommunications company. Verizon's future had been literally forever. But how did they get here? What led Verizon to this dangerous position? The very same day 7 years ago, McAdam took the helm of Verizon. He has massive plans for the telecommunications giant, but first, there's something he needs to do. He needed to regain ownership of Verizon Wireless. This was by far their most profitable division, but there was a problem. 45% of it was owned by another telecom giant, Vodafone. Why did another company own part of this one division? Well, in 2000, back when Verizon was called Bell Atlantic, the two companies formed a joint venture, Verizon Wireless. It was actually its own independent company with two gigantic parents. At this time, both companies were primarily in wired services like landlines, but this new venture was Bell Atlantic and Vodafone's first step into the world of wireless mobile phones. Naturally, this industry was about to explode. About a dozen years later, Verizon Wireless was unbelievably profitable. In 2011, he had generated over $70 billion in revenue and had an EBITDA margin of 44.8%, which was really impressive. But remember, Verizon only inherited about half of this. The other half was going to Vodafone. To achieve his long-term plans, McAdams wanted to secure this extra revenue. He wanted to claim all of it. So, in 2013, Verizon came to an agreement with Vodafone. They would buy out their 45% stake for $130 billion. That's a lot of money, but I think it's significant. Immediately, the company secured a new colossal stream of revenue. Looking at their 2014 annual report, Verizon Wireless generated $87.6 billion in wireless revenues, an increase of 8.2% over 2013. Not only was this segment growing fast, it was now all going to Verizon. But this move came with a significant downside. No company just has $150 billion lying around, especially in 2014. To finance this deal, Verizon secured a colossal $61 billion bridge loan. They also issued a $49 billion bond offering, meaning they were borrowing even more money from investors. Yet, this didn't deter McAdams. All things considered, it was the right move, as it was a guaranteed jump in their revenue. With his confidence bolstered, he quickly moved ahead with the next step in his plan, which, in retrospect, wasn't as well thought out. In 2015, Verizon acquired AOL for $4.4 billion. Then, just 2 years later, they acquired Yahoo for $4.5 billion. These seemed like strange purchases, but McAdams had a huge ambitions for them. He was going to challenge the rule of Facebook and Google. I know, a wild ambition, so what was his plan? If you don't remember AOL, they were the biggest dial-up internet service in America, and at one point, the most recognizable web brand in the US. Their company history is insane. They grew so big, so fast, that they actually bought Time Warner for the biggest merger in history at the time. But, as you probably guessed, dial-up quickly disappeared and was replaced by broadband, and AOL was ironically spun off from Time Warner. Their story is very similar to Yahoo, the poster child for the early web and the dot-com bubble, which quickly shrank in the 2000s. So why did McAdams bet on these two companies and to pay about $9 billion for them? Well, both of these companies had gone through a metamorphosis. AOL was now a digital advertising platform. Like Facebook, they provided targeted ads across their different platforms, like TechCrunch and the Huffington Post. McAdams was especially interested in their ad technology, more specifically their programmatic advertising, an automated system for buying and selling digital ad space. Yahoo, on the other hand, still had 1 billion monthly active users in 2016 across Yahoo Mail, Finance, Sports, and Tumblr, which at the time was a gigantic social media platform. McAdams wanted Verizon to go all in on digital advertising, to provide digital ads and challenge Facebook and Google, which were both generating absurd revenue from targeted ads. With AOL's ad targeting technology and Yahoo's vast platforms, McAdams merged the two into a new company, Oath, a giant digital media division. Their goal? Building a media and advertising powerhouse. Unfortunately for Verizon and McAdams, though, they had fallen into a common conglomerate trap. Immediately, Verizon laid off huge amounts of staff at AOL and Yahoo, including 2,100 people at Yahoo. With Oath fully underway, things were already looking bleak. In late 2017, Oath reported quarterly revenue of $2 billion. Not bad, but when compared to their competitors, things were looking rough. That same year, Facebook's annual revenue was just shy of $40 billion, and Google was over $95 billion. So then came more layoffs. Before the end of 2017, Oath laid off another 560 employees, as profits were far lower than expected. So, what went wrong? As most people predicted, they were failing against the existing tech giants, and there were many reasons at play. For starters, they had spent billions on old, outdated brands, and had tried to convince advertisers to risk their budgets when they were already entrenched in Meta and Google. Then comes the problem of data. Even with all of Oath's brands and AOL's ad technology, their data was minuscule compared to Google and Facebook, both of which can sell marketers on their ability to collect data from and to show ads to well over 1 billion active users. To make matters worse, digital ads were changing and not in favor of Oath. Click-through rates were plummeting and ad spend was shifting towards social platforms like Facebook. At this time, ad blockers were also skyrocketing. Between 2014 and 2018, ad blocker users had jumped from 240 million to almost 700 million, which worked against Oath's different ad platforms. Verizon had bought outdated brands to fight against giants in an industry that was moving away from them. Verizon couldn't have made things harder for themselves, which makes it even more hilarious given their ambition. To give you an idea of how overconfident Verizon was, they reportedly had an end-of-year goal of $10 billion revenue from these ventures, which they missed by $8.2 billion. This brings us back to our CEO, Lowell McAdams. By this point, he was feeling the full consequences of his mistakes. McAdams announced his retirement in June of 2018, less than 12 months after Oath was officially formed. His goal had backfired. He had done some great things at Verizon, but got carried away, overextended, and made risky bets too fast. Yet, it's hard to say why exactly. Maybe he was feeling the investor pressure to move into the digital ad space and expand Verizon. Maybe he felt the need to leave a mark and to go out with a bang. Yet, it's not just Verizon who made these strange bets. Their biggest competitor, AT&T, also made a huge blunder with their acquisition of Time Warner. Hope someone's keeping count of how much dumb money has been burned on internet media acquisitions in this cycle. Despite this early success, McAdams had left Verizon in a difficult spot. Verizon needed someone who could turn things around. In the midst of the Oath crisis, after McAdams announced his retirement, the board of directors met to make one crucial decision. Who will lead Verizon? Their digital advertising bet hadn't worked. They needed to commit resources elsewhere, so they brought in Hans Vestberg. August 1st, 2018, Hans Vestberg steps into the role of CEO. Hans was previously the CEO of Ericsson, a Swedish telecom company, and joined Verizon as the Chief Technology Officer. Only 1 year at Verizon, he was appointed as CEO. Vestberg had a heavy burden. Verizon had a failing business division it had just spent $9 billion on, but to make matters worse, it had a massive debt, $112 billion, most of which had come from McAdams' Vodafone buyout. Yet, he couldn't just focus on the debt. Growth of the telecom giant was slow. Wireless wasn't experiencing the same explosive growth it used to. Between 2017 and 2018, revenue only grew by 3.9%. Not bad, but in a saturated industry with slowing growth, the pressure was mounting. Westberg was at the center of the tension: pay off the debt or secure the company's future. Soon, he realized what he had to do. But first, he had a mess to clean up. Westberg wasn't as fond of both as McAdams was, which was now called Verizon Media Group. It was a money sink and a poor attempt to compete with Google and Facebook. Mere months after becoming CEO, Oath received a $4.5 billion write-down. This essentially means that Verizon acknowledged that it overpaid for these brands, and now it was looking for an exit. They stated that increased competitive and market pressures throughout 2018 have resulted in lower than expected revenues and earnings. I think that's putting it lightly. In the meantime, Vestberg began his plan to secure Verizon's future. He first started to bolster their core business. As a telecommunications giant, most of their revenue came from providing phone and internet service, but their competitors were offering something they didn't. Comcast had bought NBC Universal to offer cable and more value. Then, in response, EhKt bought DirecTV and then Time Warner to improve their offering as well. Verizon needed to compete, and Vestberg knew they could do this without spending billions on acquisitions through simple partnerships. So, in 2020, Verizon Wireless added Disney Plus, Hulu, and ESPN Plus to their internet and mobile plans at no extra cost to consumers. This was an insane boost in value, and naturally, it brought in a lot of new customers, and they didn't even have to acquire giant media conglomerates to offer it. That being said, Vestberg still had a difficult decision to make. This part of their business was slowing down, and they needed to commit to a new part of the industry that was growing fast. The telecom industry was moving towards one clear area: 5G, super-fast wireless internet. McAdam had made small investments in 5G, like the $1.8 billion purchase of XO, but this clearly wasn't his main focus. They had only rolled out 5G to 5 cities by the end of McAdam's time. Not only that, they had focused on something called millimeter wave 5G, which essentially means they had ultra-fast speeds but terrible coverage, only covering small areas in dense cities. By this point, there was a massive risk of falling behind, especially with T-Mobile's aggressive 5G investments and a huge head start. They realized the only way to win was with coverage, so Verizon had to make some bold moves. But that would unfortunately mean more debt, of which Verizon already had over $130 billion worth. But Vestberg eventually decided that there was no other way. They needed to take bold action, which came at the FCC C-band auction in 2021. Every other telecom giant was preparing to spend big money at this auction, but what even was it, and why did it matter? Well, there's only a limited amount of radio spectrum, and multiple industries need access to it. So the US government auctioned the rights to radio frequencies, and the bidding was fierce. Here, Verizon had to bid against T-Mobile and AT&T, meaning it was a battle of the giants with billions on the line. Verizon ended up securing between 140 and 200 megahertz, which was a great speed with wide coverage. This more than doubled their spectrum for 5G to over 100 million people in the US, but it cost them greatly: $52.9 billion. Their debt leapt once again to $179 billion. This, however, was a necessary evil. It was more debt, but Verizon needed to secure this frequency to stay in the 5G race. Now, Verizon needed to cut down costs, and Vestberg knew exactly where to start. In 2021, Verizon sold Oath to Apollo Global Management for $5 billion. They had lost about $4 billion on their investment, but at least now, this strange distraction was done and gone, and they had a bit more cash to address their massive debt. So, how is Verizon doing today? Well, in 2024, Verizon reported revenues of $134.8 billion, a slight increase from the previous year. Net income rose to $17.5 billion, up 51% from 2023, resulting in a profit margin of 13%, an improvement from 8.7% in 2023. They're luckily in a long-term sustainable business. but they're also managing a mountain of debt, which makes things much more complicated. Verizon's debt to equity ratio is 1.32, which measures their debt against the market cap of the company. A higher number is worse, and as for 2024 data, Verizon is the highest in the industry, higher than T-Mobile, AT&T, Vodafone, and Comcast. Verizon will probably carry this debt for many decades or even indefinitely, and while it is in a better spot, there are still massive challenges ahead. But at least they're not the only one. You might have heard me mention some strange moves from their biggest competitor, AT&T. As it turns out, AT&T made much bigger and much more costly mistakes alongside Verizon. Watch this video next to learn how AT&T almost destroyed itself. But until then, I'm Hari, and I'll see you guys on the next one. HP's founders were once hailed as the fathers of Silicon Valley, dominating personal computing, printing, and even selling to Walt Disney back in the 1940s. But all of this changed when a new CEO took the lead, who became one of the most hated executives in business history. Within a few short years, HP stock price plummeted, their market share crashed, and over 30,000 employees lost their jobs. How did things go so bad for HP in such a short amount of time? Who's behind this disaster? Founded in 1939, HP is an old company. Out of their garage, they produced sound equipment for Walt Disney in the 1940s. Yet, it wasn't long before HP was massive and widely respected. However, in the 1990s, they were met by some fierce challenges. There was a prestigious autonomous culture at HP, but unfortunately, this was holding them back. The company was hugely bloated, with 83 different business units, each prioritizing their own needs and often doing the same tasks as each other. Employees expected regular bonuses, whatever their level of effort. HP was no longer a technical leader, but had evolved into a huge bureaucracy resistant to change. HP was quickly losing ground to competitors like Dell, IBM, and even Apple. The company needed something fresh, a leader to unify all these divisions to put HP back on top. Enter Carly Fiorina. Fiorina was a rising star. Rising up in AT&T, she was described as one of the greatest salespeople in the industry. She had just made a name for herself after leading a spin-off from AT&T, Lucent, which saw an IPO raise of over $3 billion, one of the highest in history. Fiorina then led the company's new growth into the telecommunications industry. In fact, in 1998, she was placed number one on Fortune's 50 most powerful women in American business. Carly Fiorina was at the top of the business world. Then came her next pivotal opportunity. In 1999, the board of HP quickly and eagerly appointed her as CEO, making Fiorina the first woman CEO of a Fortune 20 company. Not only that, she received a larger signing offer than any of her predecessors. Though there was something strange about this. While accomplished, Fiorina had no CEO experience. Yet, she was going to lead one of the largest companies on the planet. Everyone was watching and eager to see what she could do. What was she going to do differently? Was she exactly the thing HP needed? Well, Fiorina had plans to dominate the computing space, specifically to overtake IBM and Dell. Her first move was to change the company's philosophy, specifically go back to the rules of the garage. This was the work philosophy of Silicon Valley. 11 rules that encapsulate the very founding of HP by Bill Hewlett and David Packard in their garage. Some of these rules include radical ideas are not bad ideas, invent different ways of working, and believe that together we can do anything. But Fiorina wasn't just about feel-good speeches. She was ruthless. In her first speech as CEO, she said, "The task for all of us now is to cut loose from the mechanical business models of the past, based on the old physical economy. We need a bulletproof infrastructure. It needs to be secure, reliable, ubiquitous, and always on, always working. It isn't there yet. You and I both know that. But it can be." She believed the 87 business units at HP were too focused on their own interests. There was inefficiency and redundancies. HP was slow. Under the rules of the garage, he would break down these units and combine them into just a handful. Not only did this cut a huge amount of cost, but positioned HP to react much faster. Though, as she enacted her plans and made changes, a slow, gradual resentment was growing towards Fiorina. Many employees weren't happy with her decisions, and they weren't alone. But then came her biggest move as CEO. Shortly into Fiorina's tenure, she revealed a plan. HP would merge with another company, Compaq, a computer company, but these companies were massive. The acquisition would cost HP $25 billion, and the effort to merge both businesses would be costly and messy. At the time, HP had 84,400 employees, while Compaq had 63,700 employees. But to Fiorina, this seemed perfect. HP was dominant in printing and software and some background markets, but they were falling behind in computing, an industry that was expected to explode in the next few years. Compaq, however, was one of the largest firms in the computing space. Fiorina and the consultants found that HP was strong in markets where Compaq was weak, and vice versa. The merged companies would theoretically be able to find some cost savings by eliminating redundant facilities and personnel. This should hopefully empower HP to dominate the computing industry. They could surpass their competition. But not everyone was happy with the plan. The proposition had immense pushback. Current and past employee stockholders largely opposed the merger. They doubted that HP's culture could survive the influx of so many new workers. Then a proxy fight broke out within the board of directors. The biggest opponent of Fiorina was Walter Hewlett, a board member and the eldest son of HP's founder. Hewlett believed this would spell disaster. With over 60,000 new staff, many HP employees would lose their jobs. But Fiorina didn't care. In fact, she ignored Hewlett's opposition and dismissed him as an academic and musician in a letter to shareholders. Then, to make matters worse, Fiorina's letter was leaked to the press, fueling the fire and raising tensions through the roof. Board members and shareholders were at each other's throats. Despite fierce pushback and resistance, with a slight majority vote from the board, the merger was approved. Walter Hewlett attempted to fight the merger in court, but ultimately failed. The merger was announced on May 3, 2002, and just a few days later, the two companies would officially unite. It seemed like no one could halt Fiorina's plans. So, how did things play out? At first, the HP Compaq merger seemed like a success. HP became the largest PC manufacturer in the world. Fiorina also boasted that HP had doubled their revenue from $42.4 billion in 1999 to about $86.7 billion in 2005. We took the growth rate from 2% to 9%. We quadrupled the cash flow. She said the two companies fit together like a zipper, but in reality, this was far from the truth. The merger wasn't just messy, it was a disaster. It turns out that Walter's objections were entirely justified. Firstly, this doubling of revenue wasn't actually true. This was just the added revenue from acquiring Compaq. Despite her insistent claims, HP's net earnings actually decreased from $3.1 billion in 1999 to $2.4 billion in 2005. Profit margins in the PC industry were razor thin. Not only that, prior to the merger, Compaq was already falling well behind competitors. Dell had just surpassed them as the top of the industry, and between 2000 and 2002, Compaq's share value dropped by half. But as it turns out, Fiorina's problems went much deeper. In one of her first meetings with her top managers, Fiorina interrupted a presentation to say, "Let me make something very clear. You will make your numbers. There will be no excuses, and if you can't make your numbers, I will find someone who can." Ironic, given how she couldn't deliver an increase on HP's earnings herself. Though this didn't stop her from cost-cutting. She was often called Chainsaw Carly after she cut 2,000 jobs in the tech crash. In 2001, a survey of 8,000 employees revealed widespread unhappiness about poor communication and poorly implemented decisions. This was a complete reversal of earlier surveys, which found that HP had some of the highest employee satisfaction scores in corporate America. She wasn't particularly liked by the board or shareholders either. That same year, employees were asked to take a 10% pay reduction to cut costs. Most of the company agreed, hoping it would prevent potential job cuts, but the merger had made things all the worse for employees and for Carly. During the lead-up to the merger, Fiorina revealed that 15,000 HP employees may lose their jobs. Then, that number began to creep up, first to 16,000, then to 18,000, and soon to over 30,000. Even after things had settled, HP was struggling. They soon began to lose market share in their other industries, with Adele taking ground in the printing market. Some employees would even boo her at company meetings, and HP had to shut down internal message boards since it became a way to attack Fiorina. 2004 marked the last full year of Carly's tenure. By this point, HP stock had lost half of its value. She had failed to unite the company and made some poor choices, but it might not have been entirely her fault. Fiorina also took over HP at the most difficult time, perhaps for any company. Almost immediately after she was appointed, the tech bubble burst. Hundreds, if not thousands of companies went bankrupt, and others saw their shares and revenue plummet. These were tough, but arguably necessary choices, although her methods had many flaws. In 2005, Carly Fiorina was fired from the role of CEO, though not without a golden parachute of $42 million, a package so big that many shareholders later sued. The company was losing profits, market share, staff, and their share price was free-falling. They needed to rebound. HP needed a new leader. Two months later, the board of directors appointed a new CEO, Mark Hurd. This was a much better choice. Not only did Mark have actual CEO experience, but he had just turned around another company from hardship, NCR. But HP was in a tough spot. So what did Hurd do? Well, he became the anti-Carly. Hurd was noticeably different. He avoided the spotlight, turned down interviews, didn't attend technology shows, universities, or the World Economic Forum. All things that Carly did frequently. First, Hurd spent a day working at a local Best Buy. HP's road to success was still in personal computing, and he wanted to learn how customers viewed their products. Then he formed his strategy. In 2006, HP turned their marketing around, focusing on personal computers. Their new slogan was, "The computer is personal again." A huge campaign was launched to promote their new line of computers, primarily low to mid laptop models. He also began to mend HP's culture, reforming business divisions, but with a focus on accountability and results. But it wasn't all good news for employees. Even after Carly Fiorina had left, HP was still in crisis mode. Hurd had to continue slashing expenses, which included laying off another 14,500 staff to regain profitability. But Hurd's approach was different. While he and Fiorina both had massive layoffs, he at least had some self-awareness, saying, "I don't want to forget we took 15,000 jobs out of the company and told a lot of employees to go home and tell their families that they no longer had jobs." Unlike Fiorina, Hurd at least had some level of empathy, which employees saw and appreciated. So, how did things pan out? Well, in the first few years after Hurd's tenure as CEO, HP's stock price more than doubled. Soon, HP became a serious competitor in affordable computing. By the end of the 2007 fiscal year, HP reached the $100 billion mark for the first time. But this was only possible thanks to the Compaq merger. So, who was really responsible? Fiorina's instinct to merge with Compaq was correct. It positioned HP to dominate the PC market and allowed them to catch up to their competitors. But it was in the execution where she failed. Where Fiorina failed and where Hurd excels was in educating HP managers and employees on how to realize the cost and operational efficiencies and translate those into higher margins for each business. Now, I do want to note that it hasn't been all sunshine and rainbows for HP. They've since had to split up into two different companies, do a bunch more layoffs, and pivot quite a bit to keep up with the modern world of cloud computing. But through all of that, HP has consistently held the lead within the American personal computer market, holding roughly 25% market share for the past decade. The darkest days for HP were over. So, was Carly Fiorina actually a bad CEO? Well, the answer would still be yes, because HP didn't exactly earn this dominance, they bought this dominance. And if HP continued under Fiorina, who knows how quickly this would have evaporated. But is Fiorina purely to blame? Not necessarily. She had no CEO experience and had jumped into one of the top 20 biggest companies on the planet, which was also facing hardship. The odds were stacked against her. The board that appointed her also shares some of the blame. Interviews with Fiorina never had the complete board present. And if you need any more confirmation, the second she was fired, the stock price jumped 6.9%. Everyone was relieved when she left, because Carly Fiorina had nearly killed HP. Around this time, another prestigious company was making a comeback. Kodak had once dominated the camera market, but failed to adapt to digital and went bankrupt. But they're actually still around. Click this video to see what they're up to today. But until then, I'm Hari, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Kodak was once a $30 billion company that dominated 90% of the camera market. But after plundering digital cameras, they slowly bled market share and money, eventually filing for bankruptcy in 2013. For most, that would be the end of the story, but not for Kodak. 11 years later, Kodak is not just alive, but their revenue is soaring over $1 billion. Here's how they did it.
Eastman Kodak, a pioneer in photography for more than a century, has declared bankruptcy.
Eastman Kodak's bankruptcy was a long and painful process. In total, their bankruptcy took 19 months because a lot needed to change. One thing was clear. Kodak needed to move away from cameras. They failed to adapt and it was too late. They needed to go through massive restructuring, but that's not all. Kodak had a lot of financials to sort out. Their liabilities were $6.75 billion. Their bankruptcy process was able to eliminate $4.1 billion of this, but they still had over $2.5 billion left over, which is still a lot of debt. Initially, they tried to sell off their digital patent portfolio. They hoped this would provide them with $2 billion, but the actual figure was $527 million. Much of the debt was owed to UK Kodak pension plan. It's a bit complex, but imagine this is a different entity which represents Kodak's pension obligations, specifically $2.8 billion. It's no wonder why modern companies have moved away from pensions. Kodak obviously didn't have the money, but they did have some remaining assets. They sold their imaging and document units to Kodak Pension Plan for $650 million. It was much less than the claim, but luckily they agreed to settle. On top of this, there was still a lot of outstanding claims, but Kodak agreed to pay these out after exiting bankruptcy. This included an $895 million financing package with JP Morgan Chase & Co., among quite a few others. Many creditors only received a few cents back for every dollar, so there's no question that a lot of people lost a lot of money. But still, they had to be hopeful. They were banking on Kodak surviving and becoming profitable. But would this be enough to exit bankruptcy? All of this was overseen by a federal bankruptcy judge. The plan was supported by most of Kodak's creditors, but there were still quite a few objections from shareholders and more. Through these efforts and many more, Kodak and its creditors submitted a final plan. And on August 23, 2013, the judge dismissed the objections and approved Kodak to exit bankruptcy. He stated that this comes on a day when many are losing retirement benefits, and many are finding that their recovery as a creditor is just a minute fraction of what their debt is. But I cannot decree a larger payment for creditors or any payment for shareholders if the value is not there. Kodak's lawyer also said that Kodak will be a very different company than the one in the popular imagination, and a very different one than the one that filed for bankruptcy. But without cameras, what would Kodak do? How would they make money and pay off their debt? They were merging into new waters, and the one thing they desperately needed was a good leader. On March 12, 2014, Kodak appointed a new CEO, Jeffrey J. Clark. Clark had a diverse background before Kodak, including leadership positions at HP, Travelport, and Orbitz. But most of all, he had experience in change, leading companies through turbulent, uncertain times. After being appointed CEO of Kodak, he had two immediate priorities, and the first was a bit surprising. Clark had a deep respect for the staff at Kodak, and his first action reflected that.
Culture was incredibly successful for a century. And many of the people who are there are 30, 40, and even longer employees who, when they were hired, they were going to the Google or the Apple of that day. So these were the premier people hired out of universities, and some of the best PhDs in the world still work at the company, as do many, many of our employees.
Clark was going to make a lot of changes, so he asked the people with the most knowledge for advice. My first priority is to spend my time listening to Kodak's employees, customers, partners, and other stakeholders as part of a detailed evaluation of our operations, market opportunities, and approach for success. He wanted input from staff. To him, they were the experts that had been there for decades. This was important because it coincided with this next priority. Kodak had failed because it didn't keep up with the market. They invented digital photography, but were too slow to capitalize on it. Clark wasn't about to let that happen again. So his second key priority was a focus on innovation at a pace. Clark began implementing what he'd learned from past experience, and part of that was enabling employees. Despite going bankrupt, Kodak was still massive and bloated. There was plenty of bureaucracy and red tape. Clark cut through this, making it easy for employees and managers to innovate and share ideas. He brought the Silicon Valley mentality of failing fast, which can come with problems, but it's what Kodak needed. We have gone from a company that once had more than 100,000 employees to about 8,000 employees worldwide. As a smaller company, we have a bias for speed and agility that a company with 100,000 people often does not have, and that is a competitive advantage. We have an incredible patent portfolio and an engine that is creating more. All of these cultural changes were great, but they didn't matter if their strategy was no good. Kodak needed a strong focus if they wanted to survive. So, what did they do?
First of all, I believe that analog is still important. It is a very small part of our business, but film is still the Kodak heritage, $200 million of revenue a year, and profitable. And I think there's an analog renaissance that's happening. I believe there's some digital fatigue, and things like the vinyl revolution, what's happening with film now in major motion picture, some new Super 8 products, as well as the maker movement around the world, is really things that people are starting to embrace.
Clark was paying attention to customer behavior and how it was changing. He expected it to be an area of future growth for Kodak, but the fact of the matter was their cameras would never be as dominant as they used to be. Even with a potential resurgence, this would be a small niche. Kodak's cameras had failed spectacularly, but they still had some potential. Clark predicted future growth for their traditional cameras, but their business still needed a new foundation, and a part of the opportunity came from their cameras. Before Clark joined, a small part of Kodak's team was hard at work building something new. Amidst bankruptcy, they didn't have heaps of capital, but they did have some assets, namely their steam and inkjet technology. Since they specialized in film cameras, their ink and printing technology was excellent. They also had many patents related to imaging, but there was one problem. For consumers, there wasn't a huge demand for these technologies or services, but there was it elsewhere. There was a major opportunity in commercial printing. Kodak had the experience and technology in image processing. Not only that, they were already dipping their toes into this industry, but hadn't fully committed. So they got to work. With a nimbler, faster Kodak, they restructured to focus entirely on printing, specifically digital printing for large businesses. They focused on packaging slips, commercial printing, and basically anyone that needed the highest quality and in mass. On February 11, 2013, while still navigating bankruptcy, Kodak unveiled their latest creation, the Prosper 5000 XLI press printer. It was a massive industrial machine that could print 650 feet per minute or up to 90 million A4 pages every month. It could measure performance and to make real-time adjustments, meaning printing it never needed to stop. It clearly had quantity, but it also had higher quality. It used newly formulated nanoparticulate pigment inks, offering a color range 30% wider than offset printing. The Prosper 5000 XLI was the best of the best. It had the fastest, most accurate writing engine on the market. But Kodak didn't just want to enter the industry. They wanted to dominate it, reclaiming a part of their former glory. But the question is, was this enough for Kodak to rebound? The 5000 XLI was a huge leap forward, but it wasn't enough on its own. Coming out of bankruptcy, Kodak was still unprofitable, but they had momentum. Not only that, with Clark's leadership and focus on innovation, they were in the perfect position to thrive, so they kept going. They went all in on commercial printing. In June 2014, they released the Prosper 6000, which was a massive leap forward in a very short amount of time. This could print 1,000 feet per minute, which was about 50% more than the 5000 XLI. Not only that, it had better design capabilities and even better nanoparticulate pigment inks, giving businesses even wider colors. It offered all of this and was still cheap at less than half a cent per color A4 page. They were solving a huge need better than anyone, and they did this further by offering multiple models. For example, the 6000C for commercial printing and the 6000P for newspapers or publishing. Have you noticed a quality upgrade on the channel over the past few months? One of the biggest changes we've made is minimizing the stock footage within videos. We've been leaning into using motion graphics, 3D effects, and custom AI footage, which brings me to the sponsor of today's video, InVideo AI. InVideo AI is already the leading AI video creation platform with over 25 million users worldwide. But their new update, V3, is about to take things to the next level. Think DALL-E, but for video. OpenAI has been teasing such a product, Sora, for several months, but there's still no launch in sight. InVideo AI V3, on the other hand, is coming out in just a few weeks, and V3 will come with full generative capabilities, meaning you can create anything you want from scratch. Want a video of a diver exploring the Mariana Trench and finding massive structures and deep-sea creatures? Done. Want to clone your voice for the narration? Simply enter "Use my voice" in the command box, and done. Welcome to the world of endless possibilities. You bring the idea, and InVideo puts you in the director's seat to bring it to life with simple text prompts. If you haven't checked out InVideo AI's current version already, go check it out right now, even just to mess around for free, with a paid plan starting at just $20 per month. Just go to my link in the description and use my code to get 2 times the number of video generation credits in your first month. Thank you to InVideo for sponsoring this video. Kodak was now moving at full speed. They hit the mark in the printing industry, and it was paying off. After emerging from bankruptcy in 2013, still carrying debt, they recorded their first annual profit in 2016, just 3 years later. It was unbelievable. Kodak had turned things around spectacularly and quickly, and this was just the beginning. Staff continued to innovate and develop printing solutions. In 2022, they announced the Prosper 7000, which was the world's fastest digital press, printing at speeds up to 1,345 feet per minute, more than double the 5000 XLI. Their printing division was a massive success, yet simultaneously another area was slowly growing. Over the years, there was a strong, devoted group of customers who loved shooting film, a niche, but a growing niche. It turns out that enthusiasts from younger generations wanted to shoot on film. They found it more authentic and personal than digital. Analog offered a unique experience when it came to shooting photography. Film photography was somehow making a comeback, and years ago was completely accurate, and not just amongst hobbyists, but professionals too.
I could get that shot and fire off 10 on a medium format roll using Kodak Gold because I knew I wanted it to be warm, and you get a stand back from the lab and it looks like this. No editing, That's not run through Lightroom. That is straight from the lab. That is, in and of itself, the magic of film photography.
This extended to the film industry. Many high-profile directors swore by Kodak for the quality and texture it brought. For example, Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer, which won 7 Academy Awards, was shot on Kodak 65mm film. In fact, Kodak engineered special 65mm film for black and white sequences in Oppenheimer. And it's not just Nolan. Other directors, including Quentin Tarantino and Steven Spielberg, also commonly use Kodak. By this point, though, Clark had stepped down from his position, not because of any scandal or conflict, but because he had turned Kodak around, and now that it was thriving, he was no longer needed. In 2023, Kodak reported revenue of $1.1 billion, with a net income of $75 million, $49 million more than the previous year. Obviously nowhere near as large as they used to be, but still an insane recovery. They are a very different company today, but some parts of them are still the same. They have a deep focus on innovation and research, and the core parts of their business like printing are still there. They just needed the right leadership and strategy. Many people talk about how Kodak failed, but few mention how they bounced back. Their experience is awfully similar to that of Nokia, who failed to capitalize on smartphones, but after losing everything are in a totally different market, thriving. One that's quite surprising. If you want to watch that story, click on this video. But until then, I'm Hari, and I'll see you guys on the next one.
One claims it's the company's only chance for survival.
That's Hari has filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The 31-year-old
Kodak is filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy.
What's up, guys? My name is Jake, and welcome to the 7th episode of Bankrupt. There are few brands around the world that are synonymous with the entire market they serve. Band-Aid comes to mind, or maybe even nowadays, Purell. One that just encompasses all hand sanitizers when the average consumer mentions it. There's one very large brand that did that to the entire camera and film market through the 1900s. They were the leader in photography, cameras, printing, sensor technology, and most importantly, film. It was a company name known very well around the world. Yet, in 2012, they filed for bankruptcy. So today, let's explore the incredible history and what eventually happened to Eastman Kodak. This episode of Bankrupt is brought to you by Raycon. Go to buyraycon.com/BSF to get 15% off your first order. It all started in 1877 with a man named George Eastman, who set out to develop an easy-to-use camera, one that didn't require a large amount of time and patience to operate. Cameras at the time used something called a wet plate to capture the image, meaning a glass plate was covered in liquid chemicals, then while wet, were quickly inserted into the camera and used. Eastman had learned about a new technology called dry plates, and he believed that was going to be the future of photography. So in the early 1880s, at just 26 years old, he opened his own factory called the Eastman Dry Plate Company. Just around 8 years later, the company released a revolutionary new camera for consumers, one which had very few moving parts and was marketed as a simple way for anyone to take photographs. This was absolutely unheard of at the time. With just one click, and you're done. It was called the Kodak. This was an enormous innovation, and while there were a lot of rich and impactful things that the now named Eastman Kodak Company did, for a time, I'm going to skip ahead to the early 1900s, as by now, Kodak was already very well known in the United States as the premier camera and film brand. They had sold millions of cameras through the 1800s, and once World War I broke out, the company continued to innovate, this time for the war effort. Kodak developed various aerial photographing technology, as well as supplying materials for all types of military uses. By 1919, George Eastman assumed the president role of his company after the death of his longtime collaborator, Henry A. Strong. Now at the helm of his photography empire, he guided Kodak through other incredible advancements like 16mm cinema film, along with new cinema cameras meant for Hollywood. George had built the company up from nothing in the late 1800s to a thriving staple of new technological advances by the 1930s. He helped bring the magic of photography to millions of people, and as a person, he was known to donate large sums of his extraordinary wealth to institutions he believed in. However, as he grew older and became sick, he retired, and in 1932, in a move that shocked many, George had committed suicide at the age of 77. He left a note simply saying, quote, "To my friends, my
You want to see something extremely funny? So, Doge, or the Department of Government Efficiency, for those of you who have had a better past few weeks than the rest of us, obviously they have been promising to cut the budget of the federal government, and they have largely been lying about the extent to which they have done so. This, absolutely incredible, okay? There was recently a polymarket bet that was canceled because the numbers being put out by Doge are so unreliable that they don't even want to hold bets in it. Like it would denigrate the credibility of the poly market in order to accept any outcomes on it. Look at this. The poly market says it's no longer taking bets on whether Elon's Doge will cut $3 billion worth of DEI contracts by the end of February, as its own data tracker is too unreliable. The market asked, will Doge cut $3 billion of DEI contracts before March and hit a volume of 16,352? The outcome was based on data collected by Doge Tracker. However, they canceled the market because the underlying data used for the market's resolution source changed. It said this market will resolve to 50-50, all losses will be refunded. Or, in other words, because Doge is altering the numbers on the government record sheets in order to match the claims they're making on Twitter, there is absolutely no way to assess the reliability of these claims, short of like independent historical research, which they can't rely on the Doge tracker. They'd have to go like bit for bit. Polymarket, yes, very credible people. Well, no. That's the point, though. Polymarket isn't credible, but Doge is so unreliable that even Polymarket won't accept bets on this. For a relatively small pot, too, 16,000. I mean, we're not talking about like a huge bet here or anything like that, you know? Polymarket is evil, not lacking credibility. You don't want to operate a betting site where the outcomes are determined via subjective analysis or like non-transparent, opaque, difficult to read analysis. You know what I mean? Like, you really don't want a bet to be resolved and for people to be arguing over who actually won because, like, the people who were reporting the numbers that you're relying on were lying to begin with. What's a Polymarket? It's like a online betting site where you can bet on anything, basically. Really funny. Polymarket had to cancel an entire prediction market and refund everyone's money today from Doge on their own work can't be relied on. This is about as like scathing of an indictment as possible because I feel like there is a massive overlap between people who like Doge and people betting on the poly market. You know? Like, if anything, the kind of people who bet heavily on the poly market would be both believing.
If your job feels meaningless, you're not alone. Millions of people right now are spending their entire day doing meaningless work. But recently, this paradigm has actually shifted. The 9 to 5 is dying out, and the essential way our society functions has begun to change. Decades ago, stories like American Beauty and Fight Club spoke to millions when they showed bureaucratic office jobs as the meaningless prisons they really are. But even the author of Fight Club didn't know how much worse it was going to get. So let's find out why most 9 to 5 jobs are useless, why they're dying out, and what the grim future of work will really look like in the coming years. You see, lots of people think their jobs are meaningless. In one of the more recent surveys on the topic, 33% of people asked think their job makes no meaningful contribution to society. In some industries, it's much worse. For financial services, retail work, or hospitality, it's more like 50%. This won't be news to lots of people working in these industries, especially in bureaucratic office jobs. Books and films have been exploring this for decades now. The reason Fight Club became so popular was because of how relatable the main character's situation is. At the beginning of the story, we see a man who spends his life drifting through useless meetings and exchanging buzzwords with his boss. He sees his work not just as meaningless, but as an actual detriment to society. It doesn't fulfill him, and the fruits of his labor haven't given him a real life. His fridge is full of condiments rather than real.
When a rare incident took place in which gun violence was carried out by a female student, both the media and social media went into a frenzy with rumors and misinformation. Was she a femcel, a female incel, a MAGA supporter?